Welcome everyone to the 7th edition of the Champaca Book Club. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'm just going to say a few words about Champaca, which is an independent bookstore based out of Bangalore. They have a very beautiful curated list, also a children's library and cafe. So if you're ever in Bangalore, please put it on your itinerary and visit Champaca. Otherwise, you can also order books from them anywhere in India from their website. With that out of the way, I'm extremely pleased and delighted to have Veena Deo and Urmila Pawar today in our book club. Urmila is going to join shortly. Before she joins us and we begin the conversation proper about the book, I'm just going to give you some house rules. If you have questions, comments, anything you want to say, please feel free to add your comments to the chat window on YouTube. We'll be seeing them at this end and addressing them as we come to the end of our conversation. And now I'm just going to briefly read out Urmilaji's and Veena's biographies before we begin the conversation. Urmila Pawar was born in a small village of Ratnagiri as the youngest child in a Dalit family. She learned early in life the meaning of her subordination as a woman and as a Dalit. The lesson she learned about the need for self-confidence and the courage to overcome these forms of discrimination has stood her in good stead in her attempts to break barriers and reach for the stars. She is a prolific writer and has written 10 books, including 3 short story collections, of which we are going to discuss Motherwit today, which is a conglomeration of various stories collected from different collections. Veena Deo is Professor Emerita in the English department at Hamline University in St. Paul, Minnesota, USA, where she taught between 1991 and 2019. Her publications include academic articles, poetry, a co-authored play, and translations in Hindi and English. Her interest in Dalit Marathi literature was sparked by the powerful voices of the members of the Dalit Panther Movement in the 60s. Those of you who haven't got the book yet, please order it from Champaca. It's available on their website. And while we wait for Urmilaji to join us, I'm going to just welcome Veena and ask her to tell us a little about how she put together this collection of stories. Because, as I said, that Urmilaji has several collections of stories and is a prolific writer. So if you could tell us, Veena, about how you put this collection together, what was the structural impulse that you had behind this?
Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me and having me as part of this conversation. I appreciate it very much. I had a colleague here very close by in Minnesota, Professor Eleanor Zelliot, who is an Ambedkar scholar, was very well situated. Her library with Dalit writing was really quite extensive and full. And, she and I had conversations as soon as I arrived here in St. Paul about our mutual interests. But I was actually focused in African-American literature at the time, so I wasn't really thinking of translation. But she encouraged me to participate. She was doing some work with modern poetry, so I helped her out there. And basically read Urmila Pawar's books in her place and was quite taken by the short stories. And given the fact that I was focused on African-American women's writing at the time, the parallels were very stunning to me. And I got interested in them. I did some academic papers on it, and people would ask me, when are you going to translate? When are you going to translate? So that was the initial kind of very disorganized impulse to go there. But then when I actually started thinking about translation, I had talked to Urmila before. I had several interviews with her when I visited India. I also had some books from, I had some magazine short stories of hers that before they were collected into Hatsa Ek. And by the time we got it together, it was almost as though I picked few stories from each of her 3 collections. And they're all in a row, actually. Sahava Boat, which was published in 1988. The few stories from there, about 5 stories from there, are the very first ones. And Chauthi Bhinta and Hatsa Ek, they're all kind of from the collections. But I rearranged them based on what I thought needed to be highlighted. Urmila has talked about herself as a Dalit woman writer, a Buddhist, and a feminist. And to me, it was important to be able to highlight the pre-conversion experiences of Dalit writer Urmila, and also to think about the various ways in which, women have tried to reconstruct their identities in a new situation. So I wanted to bookend the stories with IA about the mother, because it's called Motherwit. And the very last one also by Dhammachakra, so that I emphasize the Buddhist conversion and the impact of what that is.
Right. That's very helpful to know. Urmila ji is here. Welcome, Urmila ji. Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Okay. Sure. I'll just tell everyone that you will be speaking in Marathi and Veena will translate on your behalf, and we'll have this 3-way conversation. Okay. And before we come to the stories proper, before I, say what I felt reading the stories and the book itself, I would very much like to know, Urmila ji, like how you started writing. When did the thought occur to you? What were your early struggles like, and, what was the moment of breakthrough that came to you?
Okay. Thank you, Champaca team, Radhika ji, Somak ji, Dr. Veena Deo, my translator, and Dr. Urvashi Butalia. She will also join, she told me. And Siddesh Gupta, who is preparing this all. So before go to my writing, I will tell about some history of Dalit short story. Some words I will tell you. My English is broken English, but you
right.
Understand, please. Okay.
Absolutely.
So, you know about Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar and how he fought against casteism, and he gave the dignity and encouragement to Dalit people, and he changed the religion also, and he gave us the precious religion to us, this religion. So by that movement, people encouraged and they started to write. Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar published his periodicals Mukanayak, Vaishnav Bharat, Prabuddha Bharat, Janata, and Samata. In this periodical, people also started to write their articles, their short stories, and their opinions also. And in that, women also started to write in there. Before that, I will tell, in Marathi literature, first short story published in 1854. His person's name is Ghanashyam, and it was published in Marathi Jnana Prasarak Masik, means monthly. And the woman was first short story writer. Her name was Shantabai. She wrote a story, Bichari Anandibai, in 1896. It is the beginning of the story. And then in Dalit literature, in Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar's periodical, there in 1933, Dalit story published first Dalit story published, whose the writer's name Dalit Gunaji Jadhav, and his short story is named Devacha Dagad Sarla. And the woman of first story writer, her name was Jayasri Sa More, and she wrote the story in 1936, and her story's name was Dharmantar Premi. And then the short story started in the periodicals. There are many women writers who Lakshmi Tanaya, she wrote 1915, Tarabai Dongre, 1938, Anusuya Kedare, 1954, Sushila Gajbee, 1957, Nalini Salve, 1953, Sheila Pawar, 1963, and Sugandha Chende, who wrote poem also, in 1964. And the first story collection was Lakshmi Tanaya's Sadhya Sthiti, and it published 1915. And after that, in Dalit literature, my story collection, just Dr. Veena Deo said, that Sahavabodh, it is 1988. This is my first short story collection in Dalit writing, women's writing also.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a little bit history. And then started Dalit Panther. From the Dalit Panther, there were many writers arranged, just like Namdev Dasal, Arjun Arjun Dangre, Javi Pawar, Daya Pawar, Keshav Meshram, Baburao Bagul, Anna Bhau Sathe. Like that, women were there also. Umut Pawde, Jyoti Landewar, Hira Bansode, and then I am Urmila Pawar. This is the history, little bit history, our short story writers. Okay. And you asked me and how I started my writing in as a short story. Now I will speak in Marathi so that it will be better. You will understand nicely. Okay.
Of course.
So माझा जन्म कोकणात झाला आणि कोकण हे सौंदर्याने भरलेलं असलं तरी तिथे काही अन्नधान्य मिळत नाही, त्यामुळे तिथे दारिद्र्य फार. अशा दारिद्र्यामध्ये मी मुलगी म्हणून दलित जातीत जन्मले, एका खेड्या गावात जन्मले. You will start or I will complete? Veenaji?
Yeah. So Urmila is telling us that she was born in Konkan in Ratnagiri area. And even though it's a beautiful landscape in that region, it's not necessarily very, lush in the way things grow there. So there's a lot of poverty, a lot of difficulty for people in terms of how they live and earn their livelihood. So there is a great deal of hardship there in the Konkan area where she grew up.
Yeah. My father was teacher. He born at 1896. His birth 1896, and there were very poverty. खूप गरिबी होती. माझे वडील हे माझ्या आईशी दुसरं लग्न झालं आणि गरिबी असल्यामुळे तरीही त्यांनी मिशनरी स्कूलमध्ये जाऊन ते 7वी पर्यंत शिकले आणि शिक्षक झाले. त्यामुळे त्यांना शिक्षणाचं महत्त्व कळलं आणि त्यांनी ठरवलं की खेड्यात राहून आपल्या मुलांचं शिक्षण होणार नाही, म्हणून त्यांनी आम्हाला रत्नागिरी एक छोटं शहर, त्या शहरात आणून रस्त्याच्या कडेला एक झोपडीसारखं घर बांधलं आणि तिथे आम्हाला ठेवलं.
So she's talking about the fact that her father went to a missionary school in the village that they were in before and became a school teacher. and was married to her mother. She was his second wife. And it was very important to him that his children got plenty of education also. And so he moved the family to Ratnagiri and had this little house that was built on a site, and they lived there. And that was the possibility for the children to grow up in a city environment or city-like environment.
Yes, thank you. तर मग आम्ही जरी शहरात आलो तरी आम्हाला आमच्या गावाकडची खूप ओढ होती. तिकडे नदी खेळायला वगैरे, झाडं, आंबे, कैऱ्या, म्हणजे गावाला जायला खूप आवडायचं. आणि गावावरून खेड्यातल्या बायका बाजारात यायच्या. त्या येताना आपलं गवत, लाकूड काटा, आंबे, कैरी वगैरे विकायला शहरात यायच्या. त्या आमच्या विहिरीवर येऊन पाणी प्यायच्या आणि त्या पुन्हा आपल्या गावाला जायच्या. त्यांच्याबरोबर जाताना आम्ही त्यांच्याबरोबर जायचो आणि येताना त्यांच्याबरोबर परत यायचो आम्हाला सुट्टी पडली की. आणि मग त्यांच्या येता जाताना त्या ज्या आपल्या सुखदुःखाच्या गोष्टी बोलायच्या त्या मला खूप आवडायच्या. त्यातून मला थोडंसं कथा खूप आवडायच्या मला.
So she's trying to get us to understand that, even though they lived in Ratnagiri, it was very important for her to maintain some kind of connection with the village from where they came. And a lot of women brought wares to the market in Ratnagiri from the village. So they would come and, whether it was mangoes or whether it was some other kinds of goods, they would bring over. And around the well in Ratnagiri, they would stand around and gather together, and the kids would go with them back to the village and come back again. So they went back and forth visiting with these women. And while they were walking, these women would tell stories. They would talk about their lives. They'd talk about their experiences. And Urmila, as a listener, was very interested in those stories. So she looked forward to actually traveling with these women back and forth between the city and the village so she could hear the stories.
आणि मी तिसरीत असताना माझे वडील वारले आणि माझ्या आईवरती आमच्या शिक्षणाची जबाबदारी आली. तोपर्यंत माझ्या एका बहिणीचं लग्न झालं होतं, एक भाऊ वारला होता आणि आम्ही 4 भावंड होतो. आमचं शिक्षण व्हायचं होतं. तर वडिलांनी तिला मुलांना शिकव म्हणून सांगितलेलं होतं. त्यामुळे ती अत्यंत काटकसरीने आणि ती ऐदानं करायची. बांबूपासून बनवलेल्या वस्तू करून त्या ती विकायची. त्या विकायला मीही जात असे आणि त्या बांबूपासून वस्तू करायची. आणि अतिशय गरिबीत आम्ही दिवस काढले. तर ती जेवण करायची. ते जेवणही अतिशय निकृष्ट पद्धतीचं असायचं आणि ते आम्हाला खाताना आवडायचं नाही. मग तेव्हा ती आम्हाला गोष्टी सांगायची. त्याचे अन्न आमच्या घशाखाली जाण्यासाठी वेगवेगळ्या. तर त्या गोष्टी सुद्धा मला खूप अट्रॅक्शन वाटायचं त्या गोष्टीचं.
And the idea that, when she was a 3rd grader, her father passed away, and that made it more difficult for the family. One of her sisters had been married, one of her brothers had passed away, but there were still 4 children to look after. So her mother had to struggle to keep food together and keep them going to school. It turns out that her mother was basically making baskets, the aidan she talks about. She was making baskets to sell. And so Urmila was involved in taking these baskets and helping her sell them and so on. But at home, when she cooked for them, the food was, of course, of poor quality just because they didn't have enough. And she said that one of the tricks that her mother had to make sure that the kids would somehow swallow the food that was put in front of them was to tell them stories and keep them distracted so that they would eat the food. And that too, she said, was inspirational in some ways, to listen to these stories and be attracted to them. And that's probably part of why she has become a storyteller.
Yeah. So असं मला स्टोरी ऐकायला आवडायला लागली आणि मग मी त्या कथा माझ्या मैत्रिणींनाही सांगत असते आणि त्या मैत्रिणींना पण सांगता सांगता मला सुद्धा स्टोरीकडे मी जास्त आकृष्ट झाले. अशा पद्धतीने मला पण मी लहानपणी काही कथा वगैरे लिहिल्या नाहीत कारण काही वेळच नव्हता, घरातली कामं होती, अभ्यास होता आणि मग मला जेव्हा मी नोकरीला लागले आणि मोठी झाले आणि स्त्री चळवळीशी माझा परिचय झाला त्यावेळेला मला त्या स्त्रियांचं दुःख कळलं. त्यांच्या स्टोरीच्या मागे काय वेदना होती, काय दुःख होतं ते मला स्त्री चळवळीचा परिचय झाला त्यावेळेला मला ते भान आलं की आणि त्या स्त्रियांची वेदना माझ्यापर्यंत तेव्हा पोहोचली. तोपर्यंत मला मी लहान असल्यामुळे मला कळलं नव्हतं पण मला नंतर त्यांच्यावर लिहावंसं वाटलं.
Yeah, as a little girl, she was definitely attracted to stories, but she didn't write any stories. There were also lots of pressures in the family to do the work and be busy and study and do other kinds of things. So she didn't really have time to write and didn't write anything until she was grown up and she became aware of feminist movements elsewhere. And at some level, that political awareness and consciousness raising was one of the ways in which she would look back and hear those stories in her mind and think, oh, there's something much more behind the suffering and the various kinds of stories she heard as a kid, so that she could actually frame them in a more social manner and a political manner. So that's what gave her the writing.
Yeah. This is
Right.
the answer.
That's wonderful. I was actually coming to the stories proper, and this is the second time I'm reading your book. I read it first when it came out in 2013, I think it came out. And this time when I read it, I felt equally jolted by the stories. Like there is so much of surprise in the stories, the way the plots are constructed. There is always this sort of tone of suffering and tragedy, and then suddenly something, comes out of it, which is very empowering and extremely redeeming. And I wanted to understand that process, like how did you come up with this format of telling these marvelous stories and then surprising the readers so much? It's such a modernist kind of style of writing. Where did that style and storytelling come from?
Urmila, सोमकचं म्हणणं की कळलं ना की
आपण काल बोललो होतो.
स्टोरीची स्टाईल कुठनं आली?
मला त्याला काही असं ठोस उत्तर देता येणार नाही. ती स्टाईल कशी आली, परंतु ती माझ्या जगण्यातूनच आली असं मला वाटतं. म्हणजे त्या दलित समाजामध्ये इतकी दुःख, वेदना, अपमान आणि ह्युमिलिएशन, इतकं सफोकेशन जे आम्ही अनुभवलं की मी जेव्हा आयदानं द्यायला लोकांकडे जायची किंवा विकायला जायची त्यावेळेला ते खाली ठेवून त्याच्यावर पाणी शिंपडणं, दूर उभी राहा, सावली पाडू नको, किंवा वर्गातल्या मुलीसुद्धा मला टाळायच्या, ते सगळं मला खूप पिंचिंग करायचं. आणि त्यामुळे त्यातून आपल्याला बाहेर पडायचं आहे. आपल्याला हे नको, आपल्याला हे जे चुकीचं आहे, वाईट आहे, त्याच्यातून आपल्याला बाहेर यायचं आहे असा सकारात्मक दृष्टिकोन माझ्याकडे होता. आणि त्यामुळे मला त्या कथा सुद्धा त्या दुःखामध्ये कुणी राहू नये, सकारात्मकच घेऊन जावं. आणि दलित चळवळ ही त्यासाठीच आहे. आणि आपण सगळ्यांबरोबरच मिळून मिसळून राहावं. पण आपल्याला जर स्वातंत्र्य पाहिजे तर आपणही दुसऱ्याचं स्वातंत्र्य मानलं पाहिजे, समजलं पाहिजे असं मला वाटलं. म्हणून कदाचित तो ॲटिट्यूड आला असेल. धन्यवाद.
So I guess she's trying to have us understand that there's no particular study behind a particular kind of style, but it's coming out of her own lived experience. She said that, there were lots of humiliations when she was taking baskets from her mom to the various people she sold them to. But then, people would sort of throw money at her and they would put water on it so that it wasn't touched by an untouchable. And there's lots of humiliations of that nature that she suffered initially. But all she knew was that she needed to get out of there. She didn't want to live like that. She didn't want to feel like that. So wanting to get out of there was something that was important to her. And her mother was encouraging her for education. Education was one way to get out of there. But she also felt like, I'd like to live with everybody in freedom, in community. And if I want the freedom, then I should respect everybody else's freedom as well. So those were kind of impulses that probably have shaped her stories in that manner, that they're both kind of full of sorrow and heavy kinds of experiences of life. But at the same time, there's this push and impulse towards breaking out, breaking free, and doing something more.
Right, right. So I also have a question about the language of your stories, Urmilaji. They are very, very hard-hitting, sometimes very rustic, sometimes almost bordering on the obscene sometimes. And it's a language of real life. And this is a question to you too, Veena, about your struggles with translating this into English. I mean, as I was telling you earlier, that even though I was reading English, I don't know much Marathi, but the language was almost there at the back of my ears. I could almost hear the resonances of the Marathi original. Mm-hmm. How did you sort of achieve this balance? How did you communicate this tone and flavor of the language?
So are you asking me, or are you asking Urmila first?
I'm going to ask you first, and then I'm going to ask Urmilaji something else related to the language.
Okay. So in terms of the translation itself, I think I tried to stay as close to the flavor of the language that I was hearing as I was reading her work. And it was very difficult for me to actually get the nuances quite accurately, because the urban and rural divide, she moved very easily between standard Marathi, more literary Marathi. And as you know, that there's more dialogue in her stories than descriptive kinds of things, because it is about social change that she wants to write about. So the dialogues, the interactions become really significant in her work. And so I think at some level, I just followed her voice. Basically, I don't know how to exactly say what would make that harshness happen, other than to simply try to represent it as I saw it, as I heard it in my head. I think the difficult part, of course, there was trying to find the nuances between the rural and the standard Marathi. And I feel like the translation somehow flattened it out. So I'm really pleased to hear, I hadn't heard anybody actually tell me, like you did just now, that you heard the language in the back, even though you don't know it. And that is really good to know. That is good to know.
Right, right. I wanted to ask Urmilaji about, the effect these stories had on the readers when they were first published. We briefly spoke about a controversy that happened around one story. But if you would like to talk about, what the original readers of these stories, when they were first being published, how did they react to stories?
So, Urmila ताई, he's wanting to know about वाचकांवरती काय परिणाम झाले.
प्रथम जेव्हा आपण शॉर्ट स्टोरी लिहितो, तेव्हा आपल्या घरातच आपला जवळचा, म्हणजे एकदम जवळचा म्हणजे पती, तर त्याची काय रिॲक्शन आहे हे पहिल्यांदा महत्त्वाचं असतं. तर माझे मिस्टर नेहमीच मला चांगला सपोर्ट करत असत, परंतु कधी कधी ते थोडंसं माझ्या भावावरून मी काही गोष्ट लिहिली असं वाटलं त्याला. 4-5 मुली झाल्यानंतर तो सतत मुलासाठी थांबत होता. ते माझी शल्य कथा किंवा वेगळी कथा, माझ्या बहिणीला तिच्या सासरी खूप त्रास झाला तर तो मी लिहिला. तर ते कुठेतरी त्यांना मनामध्ये असेल की हिने नको लिहायला पाहिजे होतं किंवा काय. तर त्यामुळे माझा भाऊ आला की ते त्याला नेहमी सांगायचे की अरे बघ बघ तुझी पण कथा आली बरं का ह्याच्यामध्ये, असं सांगायचे. पण आणि एक मेवणे माझे आले की त्यांना पण सांगायचा हो तुमची पण स्टोरी आली बरं का तुमच्या घरातली पण, बघा बघा असं सांगायचे. पण मला मग त्या वेळेस भीती वाटायची. पण मला नंतर असं लक्षात आलं की जसा लेखक जन्मावा लागतो तसा वाचकही जन्मावा लागतो. त्यामुळे त्यांनी काही वाचलं नाही ते म्हणजे ठीक आहे आम्ही नंतर वाचू, नंतर विकत घेऊ आम्ही अंक आणि वाचू आम्ही नंतर, असं म्हणून ते निघून जायचं आणि मला बरं वाटायचं. पण त्यावेळेला हे लक्षात येतं की वाचकही जन्मावा लागतो. तर असे जे जन्मलेले वाचक होते ते पुस्तक परिचय वगैरे देत असतात पेपरमध्ये वगैरे, आणि त्याच्यामध्ये चांगलं येत होतं की बुवा त्यांची भाषा थेट आहे आणि पुढे काय होईल अशी उत्सुकता वाटते, आणि काही ठिकाणी ह्या बोल्डली लिहितात आणि चांगल्या रिॲक्शन आल्या. मला ज्यांनी प्रकाशना म्हणजे प्रस्तावना दिली ते लेखक म्हणजे गोखले असे अरविंद गोखले, नंतर प्रशी नेरुरकर वगैरे, मधु मंगेश कर्णी अशी जी मंडळी होती. तर त्या मंडळीने पण मला चांगलंच म्हटलं की प्रोत्साहन ही एक नाहिरे वर्गातून आलेली ही मुलगी आहे, तर नाहिरे वर्गातून आलेल्या मुलीला जितकं जास्तीत जास्त प्रोत्साहन देऊ तेवढं चांगलं आहे, असं करून ते मात्र मला चांगलं प्रोत्साहन होतं. हे सांग नंतर.
So the idea being that her first readers were basically her husband and her family members, and oftentimes they would tease each other about, oh, there's a story for you, there's a story, your story is coming up, and so on. So they would tease each other about that as well. But she said that was one of the initial sort of encouragement, and then she had some professional people encouraging her, her teachers and so on too, people who wrote forewords to her, books and so on. They were encouraging. And she said, all the reviews that the books got were good reviews, generally speaking, that she writes boldly, that she writes fearlessly, or that she writes about experiences that are not known for a number of people. And so she said, generally speaking, responses to her work encouraged her to keep writing. And otherwise it wouldn't be possible, I think. So, and I noticed that too when I interviewed her very early, that Urmila said, I don't think of myself as a professional writer. I write because it's a hobby. And I think, after all these books, of course she thinks of herself now as a writer, but it says something about, the process of being one of the first short story writers, of her community, and wanting to therefore be accepted. So I think the more the readership has given her reviews that have been positive, have been encouraging to her.
Right.
आणि नंतर असं झालं की माझा जो ही कथा कवच कथा ह्याच्यामध्ये आली चौकटमध्ये. चौकट विलास खोले, डॉक्टर विलास खोले, त्यांनी 14 लेखिकांच्या कथांचा एक संग्रह युनिव्हर्सिटी SNDT युनिव्हर्सिटीसाठी तयार केला, आणि विभावरी शिरूरकर ते उर्मिला पवार अशा 14 लेखिका आम्ही होतो. तर त्याच्यामध्ये गौरी देशपांडे, सानिया, नंतर प्रिया तेंडुलकर, आणखी उर्मिला शिरूर या लेखिकांच्या कथा या म्हणजे कौटुंबिक कथा नाही आहेत, त्या घर मोडणाऱ्या कथा आहेत आणि स्त्रीला स्वैराचाराकडे नेणाऱ्या कथा आहेत, असा त्यांच्यावर आरोप झाला. आणि माझ्या कथेवर आणि गौरीच्या कथेवर या अश्लील कथा आहेत असा आरोप झाला. तर ही माझी कथा, ही कवच, त्या कथेमध्ये मी बाजारात आंबे विकायला येणाऱ्या ज्या बायका होत्या, खेड्यापाड्यातून माझ्या गावाकडून वगैरे ज्या येत असत, त्यांना गावातले काही पुरुष डबल मिनिंग शब्द वापरून, इन्सल्टिंग शब्द वापरून मजा घेत असत. आणि त्या बिचाऱ्या बाईला ते कळत असे, परंतु तिच्याजवळ वेळ नसे. तिला ते आणलेल्या वस्तू विकून पुन्हा काही वस्तू घेऊन आपल्या मुलाबाळांच्यात इतक्या दूरवर जायचं असे, त्यामुळे ती लक्ष देत नसे. तर त्या स्टोरीमध्ये मी स्टोरी करताना तो जो तिचा, त्या बाईचा, इंदिरा नावाची बाई आहे, तिचा गौऱ्या नावाचा मुलगा आहे. तर त्या गौऱ्या मुलाला त्याच्या शाळेमध्ये सुद्धा जेव्हा त्याच्या टीचर आंबे विकायला आंबे आणतात, तेव्हा टीचर म्हणतात, वा बाई तुमचे आंबे मोठे छान आहे. तर त्या बाई ओरडतात, तुमचे कशाला म्हणता, नुसतं आंबे म्हणा. तर ह्या मुलाला वाटतं, त्या चिडतात बाई, ह्या मुलाला वाटतं या बाई का चिडल्या, ह्या चिडणार तर काय आहे, मग माझी आई का चिडत नाही. म्हणून त्याला आपल्या आईचा राग येतो आणि मग तो ठरवतो की आपण शाळेतच जायचं नाही वगैरे. तर त्या मुलाच्या अंगाने घेतली मी ती कथा. आणि शेवटी ती बाजारात जेव्हा त्या मुलाला घेऊन जाते, तेव्हा ते 2 ड्रंकर असतात, ते तिला म्हणतात की बाई दाखव तुझे आंबे, बघू का हात लावून, कसे आहेत, मोठे लिबलिबीत वगैरे असे शब्द वापरतात. तेव्हा ती म्हणते शांतपणे, हो रे बाबा, ते माझ्या चोळीतलेच आंबे आहेत आणि ते तुला बघायचे असतील तर जा तुझ्या आईच्याकडे जा, तिचे आंबे बघ, जे खाऊन तू लहानाचा मोठा झाला. असं म्हटल्यावर त्यांना त्यांची आई काढल्यावर ते उठून निघून जातात. तेव्हा त्या मुलाला वाटतं की माझ्या आईने किती शांतपणे त्या लोकांना पळवून लावलं, जे बाईनी भांडल्या होत्या बाई, असं कुठेतरी वाटतं. आणि मग त्याला आपली आई चांगली वाटते. अशी ती मुलाच्या अंगाने लिहिलेली कथा होती. पण त्या कथेवर खूप मोठं बवाल झाला. आणखी मग सगळ्यांनी त्या खूप म्हणजे मोर्चा आला होता पुण्यात, पुणा युनिव्हर्सिटीच्या दारामध्ये, की ह्या कथा काढून टाका, या घर मोडणाऱ्या कथा आहेत आणि अश्लील कथा आहेत. मग त्यावेळेला बऱ्याच लोकांनी त्याच्यावर लिहिलं आणि जवळजवळ म्हणजे माधव गडकरी, वृत्तपत्राचे लोकसत्ता मधून माधव गडकरी, निखिल वागळे आणि बरेचसे लोक त्यांनी लिहिलं की हे तसं काही या कथांमध्ये नाही आहे, वाईट नाही आहे. आणि त्या मुलींनी सुद्धा लिहिलं कॉलेजमधल्या की या कथांमधून आमच्यावर काही वाईट परिणाम होईल असं काही नाही आहे, त्या कथा चांगल्या आहेत. तेव्हा त्या कथा राहिल्या आणि तो जो बवाल खडा झाला होता तो थांबला. असं ते कथेवरती झालं.
Yes, that was a very long kind of a thing, so I'm going to try to be good about taking notes. So she's talking about Vilas Khole had put together a short story collection of 14 stories, and there were several writers, several women writers, Tendulkar, Shirurkar, Pawar and Gauri Deshpande and so on, many of them. And the stories were particularly Gauri Deshpande's short story and Urmila's story, Kavach, was considered to be obscene, and it was banned for college education. And one of the accusations was that these are home breakers. These are stories that are home breakers, and they're not good for women to hear about. And so the ban was placed for that reason, although many other writers also supported them and said there's nothing terrible about these stories, but there was some of that happening a lot. And she said all the story was actually doing is looking at it from the perspective of a small boy who's trying to come to terms with the understanding of the double entendre that's there when somebody says the name of the place where the village they live is Choli, and it sounds like Choli Gaon, and the mangoes come from Choli Gaon, or mangoes come from Choli, and then obviously there were all kinds of obscene jokes about that. And then the women who would come and sell these mangoes, got the harassment from everybody, women and men. And it seemed like the idea was that the boy has to learn that his teacher was angry when she was having a conversation with her colleagues, and they said something about your mangoes, and she said, why do you have to say your mangoes? Why can't you just say mangoes? And and the teacher got angry, and that's when the boy started to think, well, how come my mother doesn't get angry? And she was very passive, and he would get very upset with her or didn't like her very much. But through the process of what he saw happened at the end of the story, that in a very quiet kind of voice, his mother was able to turn the tables on the two drunk men who were teasing her about her mangoes. And she said, well, yeah, you can go touch. They wanted to touch and see what the mangoes were like. And she said, well, go touch your mother's mangoes. And so you've grown up eating those mangoes, so go away. And they basically just walk away. And so her image improves in the minds of the little boy. And so it's the story from the perspective of the little boy. And somehow the band did not pay attention to the very nature of the storytelling or what it was trying to do. So it had to get a lot of pushback. There were protests in front of Pune University about it. And there were defenders who basically, including students from the SNDT college, who came out and sort of defended and said, this is not going to hurt us in any kind of way. So it got reinstated, but there was a big to-do about this one story. So, speaking of reactions, I mean, this too was a reaction. So many of them were encouraging reactions, but this was quite the deal.
Yeah. I think, what's most fascinating to me is how realistic the stories are. But they're also very complex about the use of language and irony and sarcasm. And you are sort of forced to think about the layers of meaning inherent in the simplest of gestures. Mm-hmm. And, in that context, actually, I was coming to the title of the collection, Motherwit. I think it's a beautiful word. And I wanted to know more about this word. Does it exist in Marathi? In what form? And, how did you come up with this title?
Well, I have to say that at least the way I understand it, there is not a direct word in Marathi that uses the idea of mother and wit. The mother wit idea sort of I'm bringing along with me with African American studies background. So it's sort of coming from another place. But the idea is that it's about natural wit. That's street smarts, if you will, that comes from within. And Urmila and I talked about it just the other day after Somak, you had suggested that you would want to talk about the title. And Urmila said, maybe it's about the inner voice, Atla Avaz. So she talked about it as Atla Avaz. And I think that may be the closest you can get to in terms of mother wit. From my point of view, the double entendre with Aidan was, although Aidan is about baskets, it's not about mother's gift. But, if you break the word apart, I and Dan, you have that secondary meaning attached to it also. So from my perspective as a translator, I felt like it was important to sort of grab as many sides of that word that I could, and motherwit seemed to kind of fit well, especially if you're thinking about mothers and children. And so many of the stories are focused on mothers actually using their native, street smarts, if you will, in order to be able to instruct their children or to teach them something or help them understand something and to shift and transform their perspectives and attitudes. So that's really all I can say about the word Motherwit. The other thing would be that was not necessarily supposed to be the title at all. And Urvashi was very good at trying to help me sort that out, because the initial title I had given is Woman as Caste and Other Stories by Urmila Pawar. That was the title. And then we realized that Woman as Caste was a literary critical book already published elsewhere. I think Oxford had published it by somebody else. So we decided, okay, we don't want that title. So let's think about, so then I came up with Motherwit, and it's, what was it? Iterations, many iterations or something like that. And Urvashi said that was a little too clunky and a little too academic. So let's just shorten it to Motherwit. So at some level, on the one hand, it's a very useful title. It has a lot of meaning to it. But on the other hand, it was, sort of negotiated title that showed up in the way that it did.
It could well be called Mother Gift. For the
It could very well be called Mother Gift. Yes, indeed.
Because to me, the stories are about gifts that mothers give us, of this intelligence, of knowledge, of, ways of dealing with the world. It's very much a homage to our mothers.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
And, I have many, many favorites in the book, and I keep reading and rereading them. But one story that really intrigues me is Mukti, freedom.
Mm.
And it's there that the character of the woman, to me, feels like, she takes somewhat of a backseat. She has to almost accept defeat and be shown the right way by a man. And I wondered what Urmilaji has to say about this story, in particular, because all the other women are so robust in spite of all their tragedies, and they somehow kind of pick themselves up.
Mm-hmm. Urmila ताई, Somak फ्रीडम मुक्तीवरती हे करतोय, फोकस करतोय की कुंडल केशेची जी गोष्ट आहे, जी थेरी गाथामधनं आलेली गोष्ट जी आहे, तू लिहिलीस, तर त्याच्यामध्ये म्हणजे बहुतेक सगळ्या ज्या स्टोरीज आहेत त्याच्यामधल्या बायका बऱ्यापैकी स्ट्रॉंग बायका आहेत, आणि त्यांचे स्वतःचे जे इम्पल्सेस असतात किंवा त्यांचं नॉलेज जे असतं, त्यांचे विचार असतात, ते अगदी समोर असतात सगळ्यांच्या. पण कुंडलकेशेला शिक्षण जे दिलं जातं ते शेवटी एका माणसाकडनं, पुरुषाकडनं मिळतं. म्हणजे सारीपुत्रांचं जे तिला शिक्षण मिळतं त्यांच्याकडनं, कारण तोपर्यंत ती काही स्वतःचे आतला आवाज तिचा तितका स्ट्रॉंग नसतो. तर ती गोष्ट तुम्हाला म्हणजे कशी वाटते, किंवा कशामुळे तुम्ही ती गोष्ट लिहिली, काय त्याच्या मागे होतं, ते ऐकायचंय त्याला.
ते काय आहे, थेरी गाथा ज्या आहेत, 22 थेरींच्या 522 गाथा आहेत. ओके, तर त्या थेरींच्या गाथा आहेत, त्या गाथांमधून काही ह्या ज्या निवडक स्त्रिया आहेत की ज्यांनी आपल्या गाथांमध्ये आपला काही वेगळेपण दाखवलेलं आहे आणि वेगळेपण समोर आलेलं आहे काही ह्याच्यामध्ये. तर मला ती कुंडलकेशा अशासाठी चांगली वाटली की जे बुद्धिस्ट तत्वज्ञान आहे की तुम्ही कशाचा गर्व करू नका, आपल्या ज्ञानाचा गर्व करू नका, किंवा कुणावर अन्याय करू नका, किंवा तुम्ही स्वतःचं उन्नयन स्वतः केलं पाहिजे. हा अत्तदीप भव हा जो मेसेज आहे बुद्धिस्ट फिलॉसॉफीचा, तो तिने आत्मसात केला पाहिजे असं हा जो विचार आहे तो त्या कथेमध्ये बरोबर दिसतोय असं माझ्या लक्षात आलं. कारण ती जी कुंडलकेशा असते ती ज्ञान संपादन आधी खूप हट्ट करते, आई वडिलांना त्रास देते, चोराशी लग्न करते, आणि मग तो चोर तिला फसवतो आणि पळून जातो, आणि मग ती जैन धर्माकडे वळते. तिथे अत्यंत कडक असं जैन धर्माचं शासन असतं. ते स्वतः शरीरावरच अत्याचार करायचे, ते केस लोचन करायचं, केस उपटून काढायचे. आणि आपल्या हातावर जेवढं अन्न भीक कोणी घालेल त्या हाताच्या पंजामध्ये जेवढं अन्न येईल तेवढंच खायचं. पावसात त्याच्यात अनवाणी चालायचं, पायात काही चप्पल घालायची नाही वगैरे, हे जे त्याचं कडक अनुशासन, तर ते करून तिला असं वाटतं की मी खूप जिंकले. आणि त्याच्यातून तिचा आणखीनच तिच्या आत्मसन्मानामध्ये, हट्टीपणामध्ये आणखी वाढ होते. त्याच्यामुळे तिचं ते दमन होत नाही. मग ती जेव्हा सारीपुत्तांना भेटते, तर सारीपुत्त हे बुद्धाच्या तत्वज्ञानाचं संपूर्ण दर्शन आहे. आणि त्यामुळे तो सारीपुत्त भेटल्यावर तिला ते खरं ज्ञान म्हणजे काय किंवा माणूस होणं म्हणजे काय हे ती तिला दाखवतात. की तू दास नाही, माणूस कुणाचा दास नसतो, असला तर तो आपला स्वतःचाच असतो वगैरे जे ते सांगतात. आणि मग बुद्ध फिलॉसॉफी जी आहे मानवतेकडे नेणारी, तर तू पहिल्यांदा माणूस हो, तू बुद्धाकडे जा, असं तो तिला सांगतो. हे त्या कथेवर आधारित कथा आहे. त्याच्यात मला स्वातंत्र्य घेता येत नव्हतं, यामध्ये मला स्वातंत्र्य घेता येत नव्हतं, वेगळं दाखवता येत नव्हतं.
बरोबर आहे.
मग माझ्यावर ते आक्षेप आला असता की ही तुम्ही कथा चुकीची का दाखवली.
बरोबर आहे, अगदी बरोबर आहे.
कारण ते मायथॉलॉजिकल स्टोरी आहे ना ती याच्यातली, बुद्धिस्ट फिलॉसॉफीतली.
Exactly. So the idea, of course, is that this is a story about, what they call one of the exemplar stories, Theri Gatha. It's from Pali. And these are stories that are known as exemplar stories for Buddhists in general. The idea of how to conquer pride and how to be human and how to be compassionate to other human beings. And this particular story, she said she couldn't take a lot of, individual, she couldn't reinterpret the story because it was already written into the Buddhist oeuvre of the stories of these grand women, because they were supposed to be instructional kinds of stories. So she couldn't take liberties with that. So the importance of that was that there's a kind of a conversation between a woman who was always very proud of herself. She came from a rich family and had married willfully to a robber who was going to be actually put to death. And she insisted on sort of marrying him and so on and so forth. But then he tried to escape from her and she turns into a Jain nun. But perhaps part of that interaction has to do with the fact that in the Jain discipline, she had to learn how to torture her body in many, many ways. Walk without any slippers on or chappals on, pull her hair out of her head, do those sorts of torturous things that you couldn't eat much. Whatever was you could get on one palm of your hand is all you would eat. So disciplining the body seemed to be core of what she was learning. And so that only made her more prideful because she had disciplined her body so well. And so Sariputra becomes this Buddhist teacher who's actually turning her towards Buddha and turning her away from her sense of pride about her discipline. So she has a lot of knowledge, but she definitely has a lot of pride. So it's a teaching story about Buddhist philosophy that you need to be the light for yourself and for everybody else. So I think at this point, she couldn't make those changes because that was a sort of a mythological story from the past. That
it's a very haunting story nonetheless.
It's a haunting story, yes.
Yeah, it just drives home this point, a very political point as well, without quite hammering it in. And it's so beautifully balanced.
Yeah. I had to, of all the other stories I could have chosen for translation, I decided to use that particularly because, I was trying to honor Urmila's, sense of, being a Dalit woman, being a Buddhist, and being a feminist. And I think it was important to at least sort of respond to one of the stories that came from Buddhist literature, because she has a book called Udan that was published that has to do with sayings, Buddha's teachings and Buddha's sayings. And she translated those from Pali to Hindi, and then I think it was translated from Pali to Hindi, and she worked from Hindi to Marathi. So it was important for me to at least illustrate that, because I was trying to get as many variations on the kinds of things that she was working on.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I have many more questions, but I'll just take a few from the audience.
Okay.
So I'm going to start a question for you, Veena. This is from Tejaswi, who is saying, why do you think it is important to discuss your own caste location in translating Urmila ji's work?
In my introduction, I do sort of say that. I think why is it important? Because I wanted to make sure that the readers of the translation understood where I was coming from also. That I feel like I am listening to a voice that is not necessarily familiar to me. And it's not the kind of social environment that I grew up in or experienced myself. So there are lots of reasons why translations are a little bit, there's always a gap between the original and the translation. And part of it is because of the language, the limitations on the language, things that are not translatable, and so on. But then the additional limitation is also who's doing the translating. And I think it's important to be able to be upfront about it rather than to pretend like it doesn't matter. I think it does matter, because ultimately the choice of stories, how I translate them, they are based on my interpretation, my own background of the kinds of things I have read and I have taught and I've been working on in my other life as an educator. So I think those things do make a difference in terms of why I choose something to do or why I decide I want to make it sound a certain way or what have you. So I think it was important for me to put it down there that way. It's not because I was guilty or anything. It was just a question of
I think it's
being honest about it. Yeah.
Honorable thing to do as well. As a translator, you should be able to, locate yourself vis-a-vis the work you're translating.
Yes.
It's a very important context for us to remember and honor, I think.
Yes, I think so too.
So Sangeeta has indicated a few of her favorites, but apart from that, she's asking, could you clarify the ending of Hacha Ek? I'm not sure I completely grasped it. Was it open-ended or indicative of the lady seeking refuge with the nurse who took care of her? It is really an intriguing ending.
हातचा एक उर्मिला काय म्हणायचं तुला शेवट जो हातचा एकचा जो शेवट आहे की त्या बाई त्यांच्या तिची नर्स ते कसं म्हणजे तिला म्हणजे वाचकाला पूर्ण कळलं नाही ती गोष्ट समजली नाही पूर्णपणे तर शेवट तो असा का केला असं विचारते
म्हणजे त्या बाईच्या असं लक्षात येतं की आपलं अस्तित्व हे केवळ वापरलं गेलेलं आहे आपल्या नवऱ्याकडून आपल्या मुलाकडून आपला विचार कोण करत नाहीये आणि तो जेव्हा मृत्यूपत्र करतो तेव्हा सुद्धा तो 2 मुलांमध्ये आपले जे काही प्रॉपर्टी आहे ती विभागून देतो आणि तो असा विचार करत नाही की आपल्या बायकोचं काय त्याला असं वाटतं की ती कुठल्या तरी एका मुलाकडे राहील म्हणजे हे ग्रँटेड धरतो तो ग्रँटेड धरतो तो सगळा म्हणजे सुरुवातीपासूनच जो तिच्या मनामध्ये एक प्रकारचा असंतोष असतो त्या एकंदर तिला जी वागणूक मिळालेली असते नवऱ्याकडून किंवा मुलांकडून सुद्धा. नंतर ते प्रॉपर्टीसाठी मुलं सुद्धा जे राग दाखवतात, तर शेवटी तुम्हाला पैसा हाच महत्वाचा आहे असं तिला वाटतं. म्हणून ती ती ते जे मृत्यूपत्र असतं की जे मृत्यूपत्र उद्या भांडणाचं कॉज होणार आहे ते काढूनच टाकते ती वृत्तपत्र. म्हणजे ते तिला ते ठेवायचंच नाहीये. आणि जर काही प्रॉपर्टीचं उद्या डिवायडिंग करायचं झालं तर पत्नी म्हणून तिचा जो काही अधिकार असेल तर तेव्हा तिला जी कोणी सांभाळेल, म्हणजे ती जी नर्स असते तर ती मुलगी की जी आपल्या मुलाला सांभाळते वगैरे, ती जर तिच्याबरोबर उद्या राहिली तर तीच मला बघू शकेल असं तिला वाटतं. म्हणून तो अधिकार आपला जो आहे तो आपण आपल्या हातात ठेवूया. असाच अशी हुशारी किंवा असा जो वाईजनेस असतो, आपला अधिकार आपण गमवायचा नाही. त्यामुळे ती तो शेवट तसा केला. म्हणून ती तिचा हात हातात घेते, त्या मुलीचा हात हातात घेते.
So it's more about the lady recognizing that she is losing control over everything. That, you know, when her husband goes in for the kidney transplant and he writes a will, he basically divides everything between the two sons. And the assumption always is that the mother will go to one of the sons. It doesn't matter. You know, he doesn't really think about what's going to happen to my wife after I die. And so the will takes no account of her, and she becomes very aware of the fact that all her life she has been taken for granted by her family, by her husband, by her children, by everybody. And she feels compelled to sort of be more in tune with somebody who is willing to actually take care of her when she's sick and old, that she can't trust anybody who's been taking her for granted for all these days, that it was the wisest thing she could think of to do is to not sign the will so that it would not be executable at all. And that way she can maintain control over or have the authority to do something with the financial security that she may or may not be able to garner. So she's trying to take things in her own hands for the first time in her life when it was not possible before. So, you know, one could argue about, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Or we could argue about whether it's, you know, her trickery, her, you know, is a good thing or not. But the fact still remains that having control over your own future is something that she is not willing to give up. And that Urmila wants us to see as a wise decision on her part.
Absolutely. I think to me it was also a question of justice, you know, like justice which was waiting to happen at some point.
Yeah.
And I was very pleased by the way the story ended.
Yeah.
So I'm going to take two more questions because we have like talked for quite a long time and I don't want to hold everyone up. So one question is, it's a very interesting question actually. How was the cover chosen for the book? And did either of you had any input in the final choice?
No, it's a very easy answer. The cover was all Zuban. And they showed it to me, sent me a copy. It looked nice. I don't know that it was necessarily reflective of anything other than the fact that it had kind of a rural feel to it, you know. But other than that, no, neither one of us had any input into it. पुस्तकाच्या कव्हर विषयी विचारतायत की सल्ला घेतला होता का तुमचा किंवा प्रश्न विचारले ते, तर म्हटलं नाही तसं काहीच.
आमच्याकडे अशी पद्धत आहे की लेखकाला चित्र विचारलंच पाहिजे असं काही नसतं. ते संपादक आपल्या मर्जीने घेतो. पण माझ्या पुस्तकांचं मी तुम्हाला कव्हर दाखवते. त्याच्यातून वीणाने स्टोरी घेतली. हे 6वं बोट हे पुस्तक आहे. आणि हे आहे चौथी भिंत. चौथी भिंत.
Right.
आणि हे आहे
हातचा
हातचा
एक
एक.
एक नुसता नंबर आहे.
पुढे
It's quite interesting, the contrast between the English and the Marathi covers.
मराठी या
हातचा एक. तर कॅरी ओव्हर हो, आपण म्हणतो की तो आपल्याकडे म्हणजे हातचा एक असतो, तो आपल्या फायद्याचा असतो आणि तिला तसं ग्रँटेड धरतात. हातचा एक मिळाला असं ते होतं.
Yeah, the hatsa ek is of course a mathematical thing about carry one, depending on sums that you're doing, right? So just keeping something behind for your own power.
Yes. Maybe the last question, and this was asked by Arun quite a while back. So basically he's asking, why is that not many talked about Phule's work related to education of women, except in recent times? And I mean, to that, I would like to ask Urmila ji, like, what does she feel about the current state of Dalit writing in India, especially the ones which are coming out in English in translation, and the general kind of literary scene right now?
उर्मिला, सध्या दलित लेखकांची काय म्हणजे ही काय आहे, कसं चाललंय दलित रायटिंग सध्या, म्हणजे त्याची काय स्थिती आहे किंवा स्टॅटस काय आहे याविषयी प्रश्न विचारतायत.
ओके. नाही, दलित म्हणजे आता आपण दलित शब्द वापरत नाही, आंबेडकराईट म्हणतो. तर आंबेडकराईट स्टोरीज, आंबेडकराईट पोएम, आंबेडकराईट मुवमेंट. तर जोपर्यंत जात आहे तोपर्यंत हा प्रश्न सतत टॉर्चर करणार आहे. म्हणजे मला सतत जाणवतं की जेव्हा दलित बाई गरोदर असते तेव्हा तिच्या पोटातलं मूल, त्याची आयडेंटिटी तिथेच ठरते की ह्या बाईचं मूल हे दलित मूल आहे. म्हणजे ते पोटातच त्याची आयडेंटिटी ठरलेली असते आणि ती आयडेंटिटी ती जखमेसारखी त्याला सतत ह्युमिलिएशन करत असते, त्याला सतत पिंचिंग करत असते, सतत त्याला त्याची जाणीव देत असते. या ना त्या प्रकाराने म्हणजे आधी आम्ही लहान होतो किंवा माझे वडील किंवा आजोबा त्यावेळेला अनटचेबिलिटी होती, म्हणजे टच केल्यावर काहीतरी होतं. आता अनटचेबिलिटी गेली, परंतु तुम्ही कमी आहात आणि आम्ही श्रेष्ठ आहोत, तुम्ही कनिष्ठ आहात, ही जी मानसिकता आहे ती गेलेली नाहीये. त्यामुळे आता हे लेखक लिहितात. म्हणजे चांगल्या डॉक्टर प्रज्ञा पवार, स्नेहा पवारांची मुलगी जी आहे, तिच्या आता कथासंग्रह, नाटक खूप चांगल्या पद्धतीने ती लिहिते, या सगळ्या समाजाला भिडते. नंतर श्री आशालता कांबळे, उषा आंबोरे, छाया कोरेगावकर, बऱ्याच मुली चांगल्या साहित्य लिहित आहेत. आणि आम्ही इतिहास घडवला या पुस्तकामध्ये ज्या स्त्रियांच्या मी मुलाखती घेतल्या त्यांच्याही पुढचं जनरेशन आता त्यालाही जात चुकलेली नाहीये, त्यामुळे ते लिहितात. आणि इथपर्यंत ट्रान्सलेट कर पुढे.
So it seems like there is a lot more younger generation of writers who are writing quite a bit, and they think of it as Ambedkarite writing, because ultimately, even as the baby is growing up in the womb, if the mother has been identified as Dalit, the child already has a certain identification stuck to that baby. So it's really important, to understand that kind of hierarchy of who belongs and who doesn't belong and who is better than whom, that seems to keep coming up again and again. But those hierarchies haven't completely disappeared, and that's promoting a lot of Ambedkarite writing by younger generation of women. Daya Pawar's daughter, for instance, Professor Pradnya Lokhande, she's been writing. When I met her, she had a poetry collection, but now it seems like she's got short stories and other things, plays and things as well. So there's a whole lot more coming out from the younger generation of writers as well.
Okay.
So she seems to be very hopeful about it.
Right, right.
या
Thank you so much.
आणि आता नवीन जनरेशन जे आहे म्हणजे नवीन मीडिया आहे हा नवीन जो आता मोबाईल आहे किंवा फेसबुक आहे व्हॉट्सअप याच्यावरून सुद्धा हे साहित्य येत आहे त्या साहित्याला तसा काही दर्जा का फारसा नसला तरी पण बऱ्याच चांगलं साहित्य येते चांगलं साहित्य लिहिलं जाते कारण तो मीडिया चेंज झालाय आता थोडा मीडिया चेंज झालाय त्यामुळे तिथेही आपल्याला दिसतं की तो जो ह्याचा दलित असण्याचा जो त्रास आहे की ते तो जो ह्युमिलेशन आहे ती जी मानसिकता आहे त्याचं दर्शन तिथेही होतं त्या मीडियाच्या वरती आलेल्या साहित्यातून कविता कथा वगैरे
So that kind of distinction or discrimination happens in different uses of the media as well, she was saying. But lots of new writing is coming out and trying to use a lot of different kinds of media as well. And internationally, I know that there's a lot more work that's happening, specifically in Europe, in the United States, and elsewhere, on Dalit literature in general, I think, from all over India. And that's being talked about even from Nepal, for instance. And there's a lot of conversation around those ideas of domination and subordination. As a matter of fact, Isabel Wilkerson, an African-American writer, a journalist who was a journalist with New York Times, she has just come out with a book called Caste. And she's actually reframing the idea of race in the context of caste in the Indian context, and so it's a very interesting kind of time to think about how many ways people are unpacking the idea in different contexts. Yeah.
Right, right. That really is wonderful to hear, and we'll all wait for more translations of Urmila ji's stories from Zuban or whoever is publishing this.
Thank
And
you.
until then, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you especially Veena for joining us at a very odd time, I know, at your end. And thank you.
It's morning. It's fine. Thank you.
Thank
you
Veena.
all.
Thank you, Veena ji. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Champaca, as well.
What is the name?
Thanks, Champaca, Radhika, Urvashi,
Somak,
everybody.
thank you.
And
Radhika,
you, Somak.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks up to you. Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Please